She stood in the doorway of a house that was never going to be hers, holding a bouquet of flowers she had picked herself, and she listened to a woman she had never met tell her that she was not enough. Grace was 26 years old. She had worked 6 days a week for 4 years at a small tailoring shop in a town where everyone knew her name, not because she came from money, but because she never once let anyone leave her shop feeling smaller than when they walked in. And on that afternoon, standing in front of Eleanor Whitfield, the most powerful woman in that town, Grace heard the words that would follow her for the rest of her life.
You are too poor for my son.
Grace did not cry. She did not argue. She stood there, her hands folded in front of her, her face steady, while a woman worth more money than Grace would see in 10 lifetimes looked her up and down like she was something to be swept off a porch. Somewhere behind Eleanor, in the hallway of that enormous house, her son Daniel stood frozen, unable to say a single word in defense of the woman he loved. And Grace, in that single moment, made a decision that no one in that house understood. She smiled. She thanked Eleanor for her time, and she walked out the front door without looking back. What Eleanor Whitfield did not know, what she could not possibly have imagined standing in her marble foyer that afternoon, was that in less than 6 months, everything she had built her entire identity around was going to collapse. And when it happened, when the walls finally came down around her, there was only one person left standing who could help her rebuild any of it. The very same woman she had called too poor to sit at her table. This is the story of what happens when pride runs face first into consequence, and when the person you humiliated turns out to be the only one willing to save you anyway. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what really happened between these 3 people, you have to understand who each of them was before that afternoon in the Whitfield foyer. Eleanor Whitfield built an empire out of nothing more than sheer will. She owned 3 hotels, a dozen commercial properties, and a transportation company that moved goods across 5 states. She was respected everywhere she went, and she was feared just as much. In Eleanor's mind, everything she had built existed to protect one thing above all else, the Whitfield name, and she was not about to let a woman with a sewing machine and a rented apartment attach herself to it. Grace, on the other hand, had nothing that Eleanor would have called valuable. No property, no inheritance, no family name that opened doors. What Grace did have was a reputation that money could not buy. People in that town trusted her with their torn jackets, their children's school uniforms, their wedding dresses, because Grace treated every single person who walked into her shop the same way, with patience and quiet respect. She never once mentioned it to anyone. But there were people in that town who owed Grace far more than they owed the bank, and none of them had forgotten it.
Don't you worry about it, Mr. Gable. It's my pleasure.
You're too kind.
And then there was Daniel, standing in the middle of 2 women who each believed they were protecting him. Daniel had spent years trying to live up to his mother's expectations, and just as many years quietly falling further away from them. He loved Grace, but on that afternoon, standing in his mother's house, he said nothing. He let his mother's words hang in the air, and he let Grace walk out that door alone. That single moment of silence would haunt him far more than anything his mother ever said. So here's what you need to be asking yourself as this story unfolds. Why did a woman with more money and more power than anyone in that town feel so threatened by a seamstress with nothing to her name? This story is not about revenge, and it was never going to be about revenge. Grace to come to the house on a Sunday afternoon, telling her that his mother wanted to finally meet the woman he had been talking about for months. Grace had spent the morning choosing her dress carefully, not because she needed Eleanor Whitfield's approval, but because she understood exactly how much this meeting meant to Daniel. She picked flowers from her own small garden on her way out the door, thinking that a simple gesture of kindness would be the right way to begin a relationship with the family she hoped to one day be part of. She had no idea that nothing she brought with her that day would matter at all. The house was larger than anything Grace had ever stood inside of, with high ceilings and a marble floor that echoed with every step she took toward the sitting room where Eleanor was waiting. Daniel walked beside her, quiet in a way Grace had never seen before, and she should have noticed it as a warning, but she did not. Eleanor did not stand when they entered. She remained seated in a high-backed chair, looking at Grace the way a person looks at something they are deciding whether or not to keep. The silence stretched on long enough that Grace felt it settle into her chest before a single word was spoken. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made the words land harder than if she had shouted them. "You are the girl trying to marry my son," she said, "and you are too poor to marry into my family." Grace felt the flowers grow heavy in her hands. She glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he stood frozen beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. Eleanor continued, telling Grace plainly that money was almost everything in this world, and that she would never be her daughter-in-law. Not now, not ever. Grace could have argued. She could have listed every reason why Eleanor was wrong about her, every sacrifice she had made, every person in that town who trusted her more than they trusted anyone with money. Instead, she set the flowers down gently on the table beside her, thanked Eleanor for her time in a voice that did not shake, and turned toward the door. She did not look at Daniel on her way out, not because she was angry with him, but because she could not bear to see him standing there, silent, while his mother tore her apart in his own living room. Grace did not cry on the walk home. She did not cry when she unlocked the door to her small apartment, or when she hung her coat by the door the way she did every single evening. It was only later, sitting alone at her kitchen table with the lights off, that the tears finally came, and even then, she was not crying for herself. She was crying for Daniel, for the years he had spent trying to please a woman who measured love in bank statements, and for the quiet, painful realization that loving him might mean losing everything else in the process. Back at the house, Daniel stood in the doorway long after Grace's footsteps had faded down the front steps. He did not speak to his mother. He did not defend himself for his silence, because there was nothing he could say that would undo it. Instead, he walked upstairs to his room, closed the door, and sat with a decision forming in his mind, one that his mother had no idea was coming, and one that would eventually put everything Eleanor Whitfield had built at risk of falling apart entirely. Word of what happened inside the Whitfield house did not stay inside that house for long. Within days, people across town were talking about it in hushed tones at the market, in church pews, in the small tailoring shop where Grace still showed up every morning at the same time as always. Nobody heard the story from Grace herself, because she never once mentioned it to a single customer. It was Daniel's own driver who had overheard part of the conversation through an open window, and from there, the story spread the way stories do in a town where everyone has known everyone else for decades. Most people who heard it did not feel sorry for Eleanor Whitfield. They felt sorry for Grace, and more than a few of them began to quietly question a woman they had spent years being afraid to question at all. Eleanor noticed the shift almost immediately, though she would never have admitted it out loud. Fewer people greeted her with the same warmth at the market. A longtime business associate she had known for 15 years suddenly seemed harder to reach on the phone. She told herself it meant nothing, that people in this town had always been prone to gossip, and that her name still carried more weight than any rumor ever could. What Eleanor did not know, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that one of her most important transportation contracts, the one responsible for nearly a third of her company's revenue, was quietly falling apart behind the scenes, and the man on the other end of that contract had a connection to Grace that Eleanor could never have predicted. Daniel, meanwhile, had made his decision. He stopped showing up at the family office the following Monday, and he did not offer his mother an explanation. For years, Daniel had worked under Eleanor's direction, managing accounts and contracts he never truly believed in, telling himself that loyalty to his mother was worth more than his own opinions. That belief had quietly ended the moment he watched Grace walk out the front door alone. Eleanor called him twice that week. He did not answer either time. And for a woman who was used to controlling every outcome in her life, her own son's silence became its own kind of warning she refused to take seriously. Grace, through all of this, did exactly what she had always done. She opened her shop every morning at 7, and she closed it every evening at 6. She fixed torn sleeves and hemmed skirts for people who could barely afford to pay her, and she never once brought up what had happened at the Whitfield house, even when customers gently tried to ask. She had no idea that a decision she made months earlier, a small kindness extended to a struggling business owner passing through town, was about to become the very thing that would determine whether Eleanor Whitfield's empire survived the year at all. Eleanor Whitfield believed, as she always had, that her greatest threats came from competitors, from the economy, from forces outside her control. She had no idea that the storm gathering around her had nothing to do with any of that. The truth came to Eleanor by accident, the way most truths eventually do. Her lead attorney sat across from her one afternoon, explaining that the transportation contract she was so desperate to save depended entirely on a small cooperative of independent shop owners who controlled the warehouse space her trucks needed along the southern route. Eleanor asked who ran the cooperative, expecting a name that meant nothing to her. Instead, she heard the name of a woman she had spent months trying to forget. Years earlier, when a struggling leather goods trader had been on the verge of losing everything, it was Grace who had quietly covered his rent for 3 months, asking for nothing in return, never mentioning it to anyone. That trader never forgot it, and neither did the dozen other business owners Grace had helped the same way over the years, without a single one of them owing her a debt she ever intended to collect. Eleanor sat in silence for a long time after her attorney left the room. She thought about the marble floor in her sitting room, the flowers Grace had set down so gently before walking out, the calm and steady voice that had thanked her for her time instead of begging for a chance she had already been denied. Eleanor had spent her entire life believing that power came from what a person owned, from bank accounts and property, and a name people were afraid to challenge. She was only now beginning to understand that Grace had built a different kind of power entirely, one made out of years of small, unremarkable kindnesses that Eleanor had never once considered worth noticing. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Whitfield had no leverage left to pull. Her attorneys had exhausted every alternative. Her oldest contacts had nothing left to offer her. Her own son was no longer answering her calls. The only path left standing between Eleanor and the total collapse of everything she had spent her life building ran directly through the one person she had told that she was too poor to matter. Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror the morning she finally decided to go see Grace, and she heard her own voice from months earlier repeating itself in her head, clear as the day she had said it. "You are the girl trying to marry my son. You are too poor to marry into my family." She had meant every word of it then. Standing there now, she was no longer sure the words had ever meant what she thought they did. Grace was closing her shop for the evening when she looked up and saw Eleanor Whitfield standing outside the door, alone, without the driver who usually followed her everywhere, without the composure she had worn like armor in her own living room months earlier. Grace unlocked the door and stepped aside to let her in, saying nothing, waiting. Eleanor stood in the small shop for a long moment, looking around at the shelves of fabric and the sewing machine Grace had used every single day for 4 years, and for the first time since anyone in that town had known her, Eleanor Whitfield did not seem to know what to say. When she finally spoke, her voice did not carry the same certainty it once had. She told Grace about the contract, about the cooperative, about the warehouse space her company needed and could not get without it. She did not order. She did not demand. She asked, plainly and quietly, if Grace would be willing to help her. Grace listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Eleanor finished, Grace did not hesitate. She told Eleanor she would speak with the cooperative the following morning, and she meant it, without a single condition attached to the offer. Eleanor stood there, waiting for the moment Grace would remind her of what she had said months earlier, waiting for some quiet act of retribution disguised as help. It never came. It was that quiet, unconditional grace that finally broke through everything Eleanor had spent her life building around herself. She told Grace she was sorry, not as a formality, not as a means to secure the deal she needed, but because for the first time, she understood exactly what she had almost destroyed. She admitted that she had been wrong, not only about Grace, but about what actually made a family worth protecting in the first place. Daniel, who had been standing outside the shop the entire time, finally stepped through the door, and for the first time in months, his mother did not object to what she saw standing in front of her. Money had built Eleanor Whitfield an empire, but it was never going to be enough to build a legacy that meant anything at all. In the end, it was not her wealth that saved her family from collapse. It was the kindness of the very woman she had once called too poor to sit at her table, a woman who never once needed Eleanor's permission to know exactly who she was. There is something worth sitting with in a story like this one. Eleanor Whitfield had every advantage money could buy, and none of it protected her from the one thing that almost destroyed everything she cared about, her own pride. Grace had nothing that Eleanor considered valuable, and yet she was the only person standing between the Whitfield family and total collapse when it mattered most. It is easy to measure a person by what they own. It is far harder and far more telling to measure them by how they treat someone they believe they will never need. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had more money, but less character than you did? Tell us about it in the comments. We genuinely want to hear your story. If this one moved you, wait until you hear what happens next. A maid, working quietly, and overhears a secret her employer would do anything to keep buried. That story is coming very soon. Subscribe now so you never miss one of these stories. We release a new one every week.